Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Unlock the Door Radio with your host, Michael Cross here. Tonight, we have a really special guest all the way from Australia who has done a lot of research on narcissism. She's an author, and her name's Anne Manne. Hello, Anne.
Hello, Michael.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just jump right in and start dealing with all those narcissists.
Well, I'm a full-time writer. I write for The Monthly, a magazine here that has longer essays. I've written columns for newspapers in Australia, the Fairfax, the main press, and also in the Australian. So I've done a lot of writing for quite a long time. This is my third book, and I've been fascinated for a really long time.
Yeah, what I ran across that I thought looked really interesting was a book you wrote a while back called The Life of I.
Yes, that came out this year, and the subtitle is The New Culture of Narcissism, and that was what I was interested in tracking. The subtitle, The New Culture of Narcissism, is a spin-off from Christopher Lash's book back in the late 70s, which was called The Culture of Narcissism. And that became a classic in the area and created a lot of interest. But I think that the evidence shows that the problem of narcissism has become a whole lot worse since he first wrote that. So I've been researching for a number of years and gathering all sorts of examples. And also, I wanted to centre it in the same way as Christopher Lash does, in that I want to look at, first of all, the individual psyche, the individual psychology that makes up the narcissist. And I also wanted to think about the ways in which narcissism plays out in the larger society. So it was always, for me, the Holy Grail was to try and bring together these two different aspects of narcissism, the individual and the society.
Okay. What exactly, now a lot of people have heard the term narcissist. They're probably not aware that Sigmund Freud was the one who codified it into psychology. But what exactly is a narcissist?
Well, a lot of people think that it's simply someone who's in love with themselves and who is self-centered. And this comes from the great myth of Narcissus, who, as everyone who is listening would know, was someone who was so in love with himself that the gods decided to punish him, and he was stared into the lily pond, couldn't tear himself away from his own image, was addicted to the image of himself, and finally pined away and died, and all that was left by the pond was this little flower, Narcissus. So most people get the idea that narcissism is about self-love, but in fact it's a lot of modern social psychology shows that there are really clear elements which tell us a lot more than just this aspect of self-love, and it's a lot more complex than just having a simple case of selfishness. There are three, what I call the three E's, are really the central scaffolding of the narcissistic character. And the first element is a sense of entitlement, that you are superior to others, and this is shown on standard psychological measures. The second is a willingness to exploit others, and the third is a lack of empathy. It's marked also by a grandiosity, a sense that you are really more deserving of life's privileges and perks than other people, that you are superior to other people. And it's a strategy for social dominance, for really making sure that you've made your mark on any group, that you're getting the credit for a group activity. And it's also most problematic, I think, in the workplace or in the family, marked by really strong aggression when the person is challenged, which can be quite an outburst, a fire hose of rage, verbal rage just spraying over you when you challenge that person or if they're humiliated. So it's it's something that's quality that's really quite difficult to be around. If you really wanted to get down to the very essence of it, it's where the balance between self and the other person, has gone awry, it's gone all wrong, and the self has expanded to fill far too much space, and there is not enough awareness, if any, of the other person.
Well, how does that differ? And then we'll get on to how the other pluses and minuses when it comes to the certain individuals. How does that differ from like psychopaths and sociopaths?
Well, there's, one could say that at the extreme end it overlaps. The narcissism's on a continuum. Some people will simply be kind of jerk at the office. Some people would be narcissistic on the milder end, and they are unpleasant individuals, or they're difficult to be around, and they have to be the centre of attention. But they're clearly not at the level of the pathological, what I call in my book, malignant narcissist, someone like Breivik, who murdered those young people on the island in Norway. So he would be at the very extreme, and then on the other hand, you would have a much milder character who, in a way, I just find amusing. Someone like Kanye West, married to Kim Kardashian, and he made this very amusing statement a while ago, which went viral because he said that he was really a genius, and when he got to the airport, he would try and write in the form where it said, what's your occupation? He would try and write genius. But he couldn't actually spell the word genius. But he said, look, it's just like factual that I'm a genius. So that's the milder and more amusing kind of level of narcissism. And a lot of your listeners would have noticed celebrities who happen to be higher in, surprise, surprise, in narcissism than most ordinary folk, that a lot of pretty obnoxious and foolish or silly behaviour, which is very narcissistic. But that's not as severe on the continuum as someone who is a mass murderer, who's who is much closer to a sociopath or a psychopath. But the key difference is that the narcissist really wants to be noticed. The person who is the psychopath might slink along and in the cover of darkness and be a serial killer like Jack the Ripper. But the narcissist wants to put the crimes that he's about to commit on the internet. He wants to have a 1,500-word manifesto showing what he's about to do, and he is extremely not only self-centered. I'll give you an example of Breivik's self-centeredness. When he was arrested, he was on this island with these young people in this terrible scene that the police encountered with all the bodies strewn around him. But he held up a finger, and on the finger was a very small cut. He was absolutely determined, obsessed by getting, the policeman said later, a band-aid for sticking plaster to cover this very small cut, while the bodies of the young people he had slain were lying all around him. So this extraordinary kind of self-focus. At the same time, he then used the courtroom as a means of broadcasting his far-right ideology. He wanted to be seen and photographed and to be famous, and he had already had plastic surgery at an early age. He was a gym junkie. He went on steroids. There was tremendous obsession with appearance, whereas someone who is a psychopath may have none of those qualities.
Yeah, it sounds like, at least what I have examined with psychopaths versus narcissists, is the psychopath seems to be much more cerebral, whereas the narcissist seems to be more appearance-oriented.
Yes, well, the appearance is a part of a whole aspect of the narcissist, that is, they are pursuing attention. And the psychopath may not have any need to pursue attention. They have a very strong impulse to do harm, but attention is not the central aspect. Whereas the narcissist, like the milder end or the really severe end, they are always in pursuit of attention. You might even say they kind of mainline attention. Attention is a sort of addiction with them and with without attention, some part of their soul seems to shrivel. So there's this continual pursuit. I think we've got a problem here, Michael.
Yeah, my internet's is it on? For some reason, our Skype's kind of breaking up there.
Yeah, well, I've got you back now. So
okay. Well, no, the thing is, when you're talking about celebrities, a lot of times the image I get, although I'm not going to diagnose them, I'll take a look at celebrities that seem to thrive on attention. You look at someone like Miley Cyrus. You know, it goes from a children's icon to all of a sudden, you know, up on stage doing things that, well, you know, certainly are not part of the children's sort of way of looking at entertainment. And it seems, though, that when she did this, her popularity went quite high, and it seemed the Hollywood community, the entertainment industry, actually celebrated this and sort of saying an image out to her young fans that getting attention any way you have to is what's important.
Yes, I think there's a lot to that we have a culture, and that's why I had this subtitle of the new culture of narcissism, where the individual may have narcissistic qualities or tendencies towards narcissism, but the celebrity culture, the culture of social media, the internet and so on, acts as a kind of megaphone for those qualities, and the person does get rewarded, and then others see that is the quality which is rewarded, and so tend to try and follow suit in some way. So I think you're right that the culture itself of Hollywood, or all of the celebrity culture, actually rewards that kind of behaviour. And we also have a workplace culture now which kind of insists on you having a long CV, and you have you're meant to self-promote in some way. In Australia, we used to have a very strong ethos of, we used to call it cutting down the tall poppy, or we would say quite critically of someone that they were, if you'll pardon the vernacular, up themselves, or they were, meaning they were too vain, that they were in some way full of themselves, that they were full of pride. And it was a really critical description of someone if you thought that they were in some way to meet any of these requirements. And that means that we're really critical of narcissists. But in reality, we've seen in Australia, partly through the impact of US culture here, but partly as we become wealthier and more individualist ourselves, that a culture of self-promotion is starting to really take hold here. And you are meant to self-promote all the time. And that in a way is in a much milder form, something similar to what you're talking about with Miley Cyrus.
Well, I'm wondering if, we live in a more globalistic society, and Hollywood is kind of it's what everyone watches. Pretty much. The children around the world are growing up on various children's networks and so forth. And I just remember when I was a kid, the entertainment that was aimed at children was cartoons and, you got the Warner Brothers kind of stuff. But a lot of the children's entertainment today is glitzy. It revolves around shows that deal with, becoming the best dancer or the best singer. And there's not that same, it just seems to me there's not any substance. It's mostly just kind of a blingy culture, and that we're raising our children, it seems, to be narcissists.
Well, I think partly the problem is that to be narcissistic is a way of getting on, and that if we reward those cultures, another place we reward is not just in Hollywood or in children's movies or in social media, it's not just there we reward narcissistic behaviour. CEOs of companies, the chief executive officers of companies, have been found to be very frequently more narcissistic than other people lower down in the company. So that there's some are more narcissistic than others. They are more likely to find ways of tax evasion. If they are narcissistic, they will have the letter I in their company annual reports. They are much more likely to claim for themselves rather than all the credit for things going well for the company rather than pay tribute to their workers. But one of the problems is that they have really huge salaries, great degree of remuneration, which is not in any way challenged if the company does badly. Then these are the kinds of ways that we reward narcissistic behaviour right across the board. I mean, one of the things about the narcissist, let's just focus on this question of entitlement, the sense of entitlement. In celebrities, that might lead to behaving really badly and thinking that you might not be subject to the law in the same way that another person is. But it can have really serious consequences. For example, I was very interested when I was doing the research for my book to discover that there is something you might call sexual narcissism, so that the higher the male is on narcissism, the more likely they are to engage in sexual coercion. Then you have also the quality, again, sort of to do with this aspect of entitlement, a willingness to exploit others, and that comes out in ambiguous situations sexually with women, a sense that a sense of anger if they decide to say no, for example. Going across to a quite different domain, that of sport, I have a portrait in my book of Lance Armstrong, and it's a really remarkable story of someone who behaved extremely narcissistically to those around him. First, he was a kind of hero and citizen saint that everyone admired because he had apparently overcome cancer and had won 7 Tour de France, this really magnificent bike race through France and parts of Italy every year, an extraordinary marathon. So he was widely admired all around the world, and he was a friend of presidents and on the red carpet, and he had a huge fortune. He was worth about $100 million at that stage when it was found that he was actually a doper and that he had been using all sorts of forms of cheating in order to win those bike races. And he got his team to go along with him, and he really couldn't be on the team unless you were involved in both doping, which was some of them were just performance-enhancing drugs, and then there was another means by which it's called blood doping, where you actually take blood from your body at the time when you're at your peak fitness just before a race, and then in the middle of the race is over 3 weeks, so in the middle of the race or at several points in the race you retransfuse that blood full of red blood cells, full of oxygen, which would give you a huge amount of energy. And he'd be lying in a bus or a hotel room with this, they used to call them red berries of blood pulsing into his veins. And then he would be able to defeat his rival. So there's a way in which he was able to, he would always say about other people if they used doping and they won, it's not normal. And yet he thought his own winning was so normal and he felt so entitled to do it that he also felt entitled to take any means to do it. Another really interesting aspect of the narcissist is a willingness to discard others who have helped you to get where you're going. This is part of the thing of not really giving credit to others, not feeling gratitude. One of the great psychoanalysts, Otto Kernberg, commented on this aspect of the inability of the narcissist to feel gratitude. And interestingly, in the case of Lance Armstrong, he would get rid of team members who were the most loyal people to his victories in the past, people who were really close best friends, and they were just gone as soon as he didn't want to have them on the team. If they didn't serve his interests anymore. So there's a lot of this kind of behaviour. Of course, if he was doing it and successful, this comes back to your point before about celebrities, if people see others doing it, then they can start to follow suit. So in fact, the Tour de France was, this wonderful bike race, was corrupted for quite a long time by Lance Armstrong and others who imitated him. But it was also something quite deep, which was the corruption of sport itself, and it reflected, I think, a wider aspect of the new economy. I call it the new capitalism in my book, which has a hyper-competitiveness as a kind of supreme value, rather than anything countering that, rather than thinking that good sportsmanship, and even if you're defeated, that matters more. The moral code. I think what you were talking about in children's programs earlier, it's really about that point. I think you were saying that a lot of children's programs weren't just about bling and superficial success and consumer values. They were actually about a much deeper moral code by which you could live. And so you can see either in that form of the corruption of children's shows, but you can also see it in another form, in the corruption of sport. This hyper-competitive, anything goes, you're willing to do anything in order for the achievement of success, rather than accepting the moral discipline that comes with acknowledging that there are other claims on us as individuals, and that good sportsmanship or decent behaviour and so on has to be a part of it, and where the other person is fully present when you are acting in the world. And that comes back to that point I made earlier about how in the narcissist the whole balance between the self and the other person or other people has gone wrong, and the self has expanded to a monstrous degree.
Okay, what was that last point? Our connection is really kind of choppy here.
Well, I was referring to the fact that with the narcissist, the self has expanded to take up far too much space. One really funny little bit of research was that neuroscientists have found that the narcissist, even when they're asleep, the part of the brain that concerns the self is still awake. So they're still thinking about themselves even when they're asleep. And that's quite an amusing example, but it becomes less amusing as other people encounter this person who is so bent upon getting their needs met. There's one person in the US, a psychology professor called Paul Piff, who's done some really interesting research showing the connection between wealth and rising rates of narcissism. We need to answer why, for example, in the US, they are finding that there is a greater amount of narcissism in young people who, when they take a standard psychological measure, a 30% increase, in fact. So over the last 30 years. So we have to sort of answer why that is occurring. And there's been a lot of discussion of parenting and its contribution to the growth of narcissism. And there's a lot of discussion of things like wealth. And where this researcher, Paul Piff, is really interesting is he shows that the wealthier an individual becomes, even if they're just primed in the psychological laboratory to feel wealthier, they begin to act in entitled ways and more narcissistic ways. So one of his experiments showed that people tended to, when they were higher in narcissism, drew much bigger circles for themselves than they did than they drew to represent other people. That they are much more likely to be mean when it comes to donating to charity. And that was borne out in research in the real world too, that people from wealthier suburbs gave less of a percentage of their income than people from poorer suburbs. And there's some very interesting research. I found this very funny because I used to, especially when I was a student and a young woman, drive pretty old bombs of cars. And I was interested to learn that they did some very simple but interesting research, where they just put researchers on a crossroads in the US, and they watched the make and model of the car and the kind of behaviour which went with it. And they found that the later the model, the newer the car, and the more expensive it was, the less likely the car was to give way to other drivers when they should have. And 4 times less likely, and they were also 3 times less likely to give way to pedestrians. So I found this really amusing, because I had noticed when I was driving around my old cars that in fact it was quite a clear pattern that the faster and newer and flashier the car, the more likely I was to be run off the road. So in those ways, the narcissism leads to quite demonstrable behaviour where the person maybe think they're more important than others, and this strange paradox that the wealthier they are, the meaner they are. And we've had an example of that in Australia. We're one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and yet we have recently really sharply cut our foreign aid. We keep having these arguments all the time that we can't afford it and we're too poor. So I thought it was very interesting to read Paul Piff's research, which indicates that this is one of the patterns that happen. Obviously, we have great philanthropists as well, like Bill Gates and others, so it's not a universal pattern, but it is definitely a predominant pattern as people and a society gets wealthier.
Okay, well, excuse me here, I'm fighting some strep throat too. That makes sense if a person feels that, well, let me back up a little bit. It seems that the narcissist, if they feel the world revolves around them, might actually wind up in more powerful positions in society. And then once they get into those powerful positions, they have this sense of entitlement. Therefore, like that's a very interesting study. I'm going to look that one up. You know, if you feel like you've got a better car or a better social standing, that you don't have to yield to other people, you know, because they're just kind of like, they're co-stars in your life drama.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. One of the interesting things about Paul Piff's work was how quickly this process of feeling entitled, and as you say, not yielding to others, expecting others to yield to you, can take place. And one of his experiments was just a game of Monopoly, and the one character was able to have 2 moves, and he's given twice as much money, and he quickly begins to command the heights of the Monopoly game. And what's interesting is that within minutes, his posture changes, he starts to fling his arms around and take up much more space. He begins to be impatient for the other person to make the moves. He starts grabbing the other person's token and moving it for him. You know, he really kind of takes over and begins to behave like a jerk, even within, a 4-minute Monopoly game. So it's a really interesting aspect, and I guess most of our thinking for so long, because for understandable reasons, because we are all societies that went through the Great Depression. We understand for good reason the terrible consequences of poverty and so on. So we think along the line of warding off deprivation, and I think that's understandable. And obviously, no one thinks that poverty is a good thing, or the Great Depression was simply character building. There's clearly a reason for trying to build wealth in a society, but we haven't paid as much attention to this question of how wealth might actually have a problematic effect on people's character. So that's another aspect we have to think about. Like when they look at parenting and children, how much do we give them? Are we giving them too much? Is there a problem with over-gratification of material goods and a kind of spoiling that is going on, that children don't really learn to to use your lovely word, yield to the other person. They begin to feel too entitled. There's a lot of arguments which come out of the US which really pinpoint essentially parenting and the spoiling of children. I disagree with that a little bit. I think that's part of it, but I also think that there's another aspect that children tend to have a lot of material possessions, but then they're also in a world where parents are quite frantic with work and other obligations, and certainly in the US and in most neoliberal societies like Australia and Britain, I think this is much less true of Sweden. I think Sweden is much better at balancing work and family, but those neoliberal, hyper-competitive free market societies have been very slow or reluctant to really put in place the kind of work and family legislation or the kinds of norms even that people can be able to balance work and family in a way that children can flourish. So it seems to me that it's not just a question of spoiling. I think children also collide with a world where schools are very competitive. There's a lot of pressure on children to achieve and succeed, and so we don't really have the right balance on upbringing.
Well,
there's an example of that where there was a recent study in Harvard University Education Department. I found something like 80% of the students nominated achievement as the most important thing in life, whereas only about 20% nominated caring for others. And they said, look, I think we've got the balance of elements here wrong. And it's not to say that ambition is wrong, but when you have such a disparity in those perspectives, then I think we've got a problem.
Well, the thing is that it seems, well, first of all, let me ask you this. Do you think that narcissism is a social construct, something that develops because of the society and the way we're treating kids? Or do you think that it's a genetic thing, that some people are born narcissists? Or is there a continuum in which a person who would normally not display these traits might still develop them in the right conditions?
I think all elements are important that you listed there, but I think the last aspect is the most important, that it's really prevailing conditions which bring out the existing narcissism in people. Christopher Lasch had a statement which was that prevailing conditions bring out the narcissism in everyone. Now, I would say not everyone, because I think that some people are actually more narcissistic than others, but I do think prevailing conditions can bring out narcissism in susceptible people. So I definitely think the culture and the way it's changing is making us more narcissistic. The simple test of that is to look cross-culturally, and they have certainly found that as China becomes more capitalistic, becomes more consumerist and more individualist, that the scores on the standard psychological measure of narcissism are increasing. So that's a simple example of where something like consumerism, individualism, in a very competitive atmosphere can draw people into more narcissistic behaviour. But I don't think that it is only, I don't think narcissists are simply made. Here I follow Otto Kernberg, who thought through his really careful, up-close work with narcissistic patients over many, many years. He said, look, I think some of this, there's some inborn quality as well as parenting. He thought the problematic aspect of parenting, there's a lot of discussion of this, is to, of course we all think our children are special, but this is a kind of overvaluing of the child where you're not just thinking in ways of, in a loving way about your child being special to you, but that you expect the world to treat them as more special than anybody else. So the child is treated as a bit of a genius, or the child is, in some ways they are inflated, and they are not really learning to fit in with others. So that there's some contribution of parenting to this kind of overvaluing and spoiling, and also rather insecure world where the parent is more focused on the child, like a trophy child essentially. If there's something called a trophy wife, it has to surely be the trophy child who reflects well on you for doing well in some sort of sports or achievement or academics or whatever. But Koenberg didn't think it was only being made by parents, and I think that we need to take heed of the fact that some people are born simply more, they're more aggressive than others, they are more wishing to be dominant, and they are more wanting to be the centre of attention right from the start. So, this is where your third possibility, I think, comes in, that when they, encounter a world of celebrities or watching the way Lance Armstrong behaves or whatever, they begin to watch a CEO and they see his antics or see what kind of a salary he gets, even when he hasn't done a particularly good job with his company, that actually begins to draw out narcissistic behaviour, and we tend to reward it.
Yeah. Do you think? I've heard. I read a study once that said that one of the reasons why obesity is increasing in Europe was because of the smaller families. Where if you only, instead of 3-4 kids, a person has one child, and so they get all the attentions on them. You got all your eggs in one basket. And so they get spoiled more. I know China's had a problem with that as well that they've addressed. But do you think this is more likely to occur? The narcissism might increase when you are the person who the parents put all their attention in. Do you think that could be contributing to this?
Well, I did look into the question of whether birth order had an effect and whether only children had an effect, because I'm aware of the Chinese example. I call it the Little Emperor syndrome. But I didn't really find that was the case. I think that overall, yes, there could be something about the zealous kind of, we talk about the helicopter parent, the excessive focus on a child, which could be contributing. And I guess it is a natural part of a larger family where you just have to pitch in. I'm the youngest of 4 children, so I know what you're getting at. The kind of fuss over what meal you're provided with, you simply don't have the possibility of that. But I have to say, I've known only children who are just absolutely lovely, and I see absolutely no narcissistic qualities in it. So I think it would depend a lot on the wisdom of the parents. One thing I want to take away a little bit from just thinking about parenting, though, and that's the attitude of schools, because there's been quite a bit of research, again, in the US by Sania Luther, really interesting, looking at the kinds of pressures that adolescent school children come under to achieve, and just how brittle the sense of self, how fragile the sense of self of these adolescents is, because that they are so much judged by whether or not they succeed that it kind of becomes everything. I don't know about you as a parent, Mike, but I thought it was a really important aspect of my parenting to try and give children a place to stand in life, which was not just to do with success. And so it's really important that children have a sense that there's something else other than being judged according to your achievements in life, and a sense of character, which is different from not that I'm not saying it's not important for children to strive and to try and succeed at things, but I'm saying that surely it has to be not the only thing. And this brings me back to the wider culture in which parents are doing their job. And I think that the ways in which we emphasise success at schools and in the wider society is that there's something rather unbalanced about it, and the ways in which we think about caring for others has somehow got rather lost in this rather brave new world.
Well, I just have, speaking of schools, I got to ask this question. In Australia, do they have school uniforms in the schools?
They do.
Okay, because I've noticed that where my kids go to school, there's no school uniforms or anything, and it puts a huge amount of pressure on kids to, even if they don't have lots of money, they still have to find a way to dress in the same styles as everyone else. So I'm wondering if that has an effect on children in the sense that again, going back to the way entertainment is, it's almost like, kids go to school in entertainment world to show off. And so when they get into the real world and they have these social standings that are based on how they dress, do you think that maybe the Australian or the British model actually might reduce narcissism, whereas in America, for instance, unless you go to an exclusive private school, there are no school uniforms?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. I certainly think it's a good thing to have a uniform just because no one has to think about it in the morning, and particularly through the agonies of self-consciousness of adolescence. I think it's a very nice thing not to have to worry about what you're wearing, and I could well imagine a scenario where the children become very competitive about it and appearance becomes the whole thing. I think the more we move away from focus on appearance and achieving self-worth through appearance, the better. But you have to think about how powerful things like social media are when, if someone posts a picture of themselves and they're seen as hot, they get all these likes, and so it really reinforces judging yourself according to your appearance, and it means that you are encouraged to do that more and more. So I think it's a really difficult.
So you feel that Facebook and what are some of the others? Facebook, Instagram, things like this are just
all of them.
They're rewarding narcissism.
Yes, and all of it's about being seen in a certain way. I don't believe they cause it, but because I do think that it comes within family structures, and I think it comes from the individual. But I think it really can encourage it in susceptible individuals, and certainly, it's a move from being seen, in a much earlier culture, seen in the eyes of God, to be seen in the eyes of your peers. I'm not a religious person at all, but I can see a real shift in consciousness if I trace even literature over the last 150 years and see the ways in which individuals might see themselves to be now this audience always for what you're doing. There's a really sweet quote from Lena Dunham, who's this very creative director of this hit show, Girls, and she was talking about her father, and she said that he couldn't understand why people would put something that they were eating on Twitter or Facebook, and she said that her generation couldn't figure out why you'd eat something unless you could put it on Twitter or Facebook, which I thought was a really lovely summation of this transition to the importance of being seen by others.
Yeah. So let me ask you, here's something a lot of people will probably be thinking to themselves. Now, of course, narcissism's on a spectrum. You have some people that don't have hardly any of the traits. Some people have a huge amount of the traits. Do you have any advice for people, for instance, who are they're in a relationship with someone? Because you said that in a family situation, it can be quite problematic, as opposed to like a corporate situation where maybe a narcissist goes to the very top of wherever field they're in. But what if someone is actually with someone, male or female? What are some of those signs that this person might be just a little bit more narcissistic than average?
Well, partly an inability to take another person's perspective, so that normally, let's take a partnership or a marriage or friendship, if there is an occasion where conflict emerges, usually if there's only ever one person apologising, I think there's a problem. And a person who's more narcissistic has difficulties usually with apology or accepting that they've been in the wrong. So that would be a very difficult aspect if you're in a long-term partnership. Obviously, if you're involved with someone who's very self-centred, it's extremely difficult. I must say just slightly against the idea that when anything goes wrong in a relationship, it's because of narcissism. I think I've read quite a lot of popular blogs now where someone's talking about they even have just a nickname for them, my narc they call it, or my N. And I don't think you can always say that everybody's, wherever there's a bit of conflict, that it's that narcissism is the cause of it. But some people who are in a relationship with genuinely a narcissist, who cannot ever listen to your perspective, who behaves exploitatively, one of the aspects of narcissists that we know is that they are more likely to cheat on you. They're always looking around for a partner who's better, so they tend to keep their options open, and they're more likely to engage in other relationships at the same time as being involved with you. So those kinds of behaviours, many times a person just has to step away. They can't change that person, and they have to realise that the problem is not that they have to realise that they're not the problem. They have to realise that the narcissist is. There was a book written by one of the key researchers in the United States, Keith Campbell, and that was written as a result of many letters he had, mainly from women, but from people who'd been at the receiving end of a narcissist and had really been stricken by their behaviour, and they thought there was really something deeply wrong with them. But in fact, they had simply encountered someone who was all of these aspects that I've been covering. They were entitled, they were exploitative, they didn't really feel committed to the relationship, even though they might have said that they were, and they were unfaithful at the same time, and so on. So this behaviour where you're centred upon your own needs, the exclusion of other people, is extremely difficult to cope with. And often there's women who feel quite shattered at the end of it because they had not been able to understand what the problem was, that it was within the other person's psychology and their psyche rather than in something that they were doing. The book was called When You Love a Man Who Loves Himself.
Yes.
Can I just say one final thing? I think and that is one of the really big, interesting questions for me was not only at the individual level as how we treat one another, but how we care for the environment. And I was highly interested to find that psychological studies show that people who are higher in narcissism are less willing to share the commons, meaning a common environment. So quite specialised studies in the laboratory showed that the narcissist was more likely to gobble up a forest or gobble up resources and not share them. They also found that they were less likely to be committed to socially responsible environmental practices, and that it's simply often a matter of really priming people for a kind of identity which is not linked to this consumerist, very individualist, very hyper-competitive, very materialistic one, but rather to one which is much more pro-social, which is caring, and which is involved with careful environment as well. So the really big question is, if we get more narcissistic as a society, then are we going to find that we are less and less willing to give up our baubles, our trinkets, our commitment to a consumer lifestyle and do something about climate change? And that would be my largest concern of all. As we become more narcissistic, that we are less likely to take the action that we really should on that looming catastrophe.
Yeah, that's very interesting on a international, global scale, that it could actually have an effect. Well, now where can people find your works? Like, for instance, if they're interested in your book, The Life of I, where could they find that?
Well, it's published by Melbourne University Press in Australia, and you can buy it through that website. And I think it's on Amazon, so it should be available through Amazon. Booktopia, the various. But if you just pop up The Life of I, you should be able to see where you can buy it. But either through my publisher or via Amazon for people overseas. But the Melbourne University Press has a website where you can just pop on.
Okay, and you're working on what right now? What book will be coming out next?
Oh, well, I'm working on a book on the Royal Commission. We have a Royal Commission here into institutional child sexual abuse. So I'm now throwing myself into that, and it's a really terrible but very fascinating issue as to how all of that came about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that could be when you get that one out there, I'd like to contact you again and deal with that work as well when you get it out there.
Well, it's just extraordinary what's been coming up out of the Royal Commission, and simply not just the sexual abuse of children, but the physical cruelty with which a lot of the children in institutions were treated. And I think one of the really interesting questions is whether there's a form of prejudice against children that an American psychoanalyst, Elizabeth Young Ball, called childism. There's racism, there's sexism, there are various forms of prejudice. And she raised this question, she used this word childism, and the kind of cruelty we're seeing coming out of the descriptions of the way children were treated, for me has already raised this as a big issue as to whether or not we treat them as they're kind of not really human beings in some way. So it's really going to be a big project to try and understand the sources of the cruelty that's involved with child sexual abuse.
Wow, well, that's an issue that really needs to get out there and make people aware, so, we can do something about that. I've been reading about some of the stuff going on in, like, the British the British government, and a lot of scandals there with child abuse and stuff, and it's really awful.
Yes, well, there's a couple of cases where narcissism is very much involved, and that was in the case of Jimmy Savile and I think Rolf Harris, and two celebrities, and a sense of entitlement. So there is some considerable overlap actually between child sexual abuse and narcissistic behaviour.
Yeah. Well, again, really, really awful types of stuff. Anything that's aimed at kids to do them harm. It's just like somewhere in the Bible, Jesus said something about, it's better that a millstone be hung around an abuser's neck than cast into the ocean. So, that's just my feeling. But yeah. Well, anyway, great. Well, thank you for your time, and and I'm sure the audience can get a lot from this, and they should check your works.
Lovely. Well, it was really enjoyable talking to you, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Well, you take care now, and thank you, all those out there listening today, for tuning in, and hope you'll come back next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV.
In a Quinnipiac University national poll, a plurality of voters say President Barack Obama is the worst president since World War II. 33% of voters think the current president is the worst since 19...
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.